Here's something random, see if you know it. Which Brian Wilson album was finally released after being shelved for nearly 40 years? And another one, just for fun. What was the name of the odd health food store Brian Wilson ran in the early 70s between Beach Boys albums? Think you know the answers? Drop your guesses in the comments below, I'll reveal them in just a bit. While you think, let me welcome you to The Versed Masters of Music. I'm Dick Carlson. In this video, we're diving into the wild duality of life of Brian Wilson, the tortured genius who changed pop music forever, and the private man who built a quiet, unconventional empire of comfort and care. But to truly understand Brian Wilson, we need to go back to where it all began, because his early years hold pivotal moments that shaped both his brilliance and his burdens. Brian Douglas Wilson was born on June 20th, 1942 in Inglewood, California. He grew up in a modest home in nearby Hawthorne, a suburb full of working-class families and sunshine. But behind the smiles, Brian's world was more complicated. His father, Murray Wilson, was a frustrated musician himself. He pushed Brian and his younger brothers Carl and Dennis hard. But it wasn't just discipline. Murray was emotionally and sometimes physically abusive. Later in life, Brian would lost part of his hearing in his right ear. It was something he always believed came from one of his father's violent outbursts. But Brian found an escape in music. As a kid, he would sit for hours listening to vocal groups like the Four Freshmen and the Everly Brothers. He didn't just enjoy them. In fact, he studied them. He taught himself how harmonies worked. He could hear a song once and sing every part by his late teens. That gift became a mission. In 1961, Brian formed a group with his brothers, his cousin Mike Love, and their friend Al Jardine. They called themselves the Beach Boys. Within 2 years, they'd taken over the radio with the surf rock anthem Surfin' USA. Suddenly, Brian was a household name, but behind the fame, not much changed in how he lived. In those early years, the boys still lived together in their small Hawthorne house. But Brian didn't care about money or material things yet. What drove him was sound. He spent long hours in the studio layering vocals and testing new ideas while the rest of the group toured the country. By 1964, the Beach Boys were becoming America's favorite band. Meanwhile, Brian married singer Marilyn Rovell the same year. However, at the same time, Brian's mind and body hit a wall. On a flight to Houston, he suffered a panic attack so severe that he quit touring altogether. He told the band he'd stay behind to write and produce. It was an unusual move, but one that changed music history. Now freed from the stress of performing, Brian threw himself into the studio. He became obsessed with creating something deeper than surf songs. In 1966, he delivered Pet Sounds. It was an emotional and groundbreaking album filled with strings, animal sounds, harpsichords, and heartbreak. At first it confused some fans, but over time Pet Sounds was hailed as one of the most important albums ever made. Later that same year, Brian produced Good Vibrations. It took over 90 hours of studio time and was one of the most expensive singles ever recorded. Now Brian was doing more than just writing hits. He was reinventing how pop music worked. But behind that brilliance, Brian was unraveling. He began working on a new project called Smile, which he described as a teenage symphony to God. It was ambitious, otherworldly, and for Brian, it was emotionally overwhelming. As tensions grew with the label, his bandmates, and his own perfectionism, the project collapsed. In 1967, Smile was shelved and Brian fell into a deep decline. So he started using drugs more heavily. He became increasingly paranoid, withdrawn, and erratic. Days would pass with him lying in bed, barely speaking. The creative flame that had burned so brightly was flickering. During this time, his lifestyle shifted towards eccentricity. In 1969, Brian opened a health food store in West Hollywood called Radiant Radish. It sold organic produce and tofu before it was trendy. He worked behind the counter himself, all while working on albums with the Beach Boys. The store didn't last long, but it showed that Brian had guts to face crisis. Financially, Brian was starting to earn real money, but he didn't spend it like a rock star. There were no flashy cars or mega mansions. His life was more confined and more unpredictable. And then came a devastating blow. His father, Murray, one who still controlled the publishing rights to many early Beach Boys songs, sold the Sea of Tunes catalog in 1969. The price was just $700,000. At the time, it seemed like a lot. but that catalog would go on to generate hundreds of millions in royalties. Now, Brian lost control of the very songs that made him a legend. By the early 1970s, Brian Wilson had changed the face of music, but his own world was beginning to slip out of his hands. As the 1970s came to an end, Brian Wilson's world grew darker. His mental health declined rapidly. He was struggling with depression, heavy drug use, and a growing dependence on food. His weight ballooned, and he spent more and more time alone. In later years, he would be diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, a serious condition that combines mood swings with symptoms like hallucinations and delusions. His home life suffered too. As Brian's mental and emotional health got worse, so did the marriage. His wife Marilyn eventually filed for divorce in 1979. Together they had two daughters, Carney and Wendy Wilson, who were divided between two houses. Then in the early 1980s, Brian's family turned to an unusual solution to save him. They hired Dr. Eugene Landy, a controversial psychologist who promised to turn Brian's life around. At first, Landy helped him get sober and lose weight, but over time things took a darker turn because Landy took control of Brian's entire life. He moved into Brian's home, decided who he could talk to, controlled his money, and even co-wrote songs with him. Landy claimed it was therapy, but many believed it was abuse in disguise. Brian was under constant surveillance, medicated heavily, and cut off from loved ones. Through the mid to late 80s, Brian made a few public appearances and released solo music, but always with Landy nearby. Critics and fans were confused. Everyone doubted if this was really Brian's comeback or someone else was pulling the strings. Eventually, things reached a breaking point. In 1991, Brian's family and legal team took Landy to court. The result was Landy getting banned from contacting Brian ever again. Just a year later, in 1992, Brian made a bold move to reclaim what was his. He sued his former publishers for the financial damage done when his father Murray sold the Sea of Tunes catalog decades earlier. Luckily, he won the case and received $10 million in damages. But even with the money and new freedom, Brian's day-to-day life during these years was far from glamorous. He lived in various Los Angeles area homes, many of which had been purchased or controlled by Landy. His reputation became that of a once great artist now living in quiet, bizarre isolation. No sports cars, no parties. Just a man trying to find peace again, monitored, medicated, and often misunderstood. After years of being controlled and cut off, Brian Wilson finally began to rebuild his life, and it started with love. In 1995, Brian married Melinda Ledbetter, a former model and car saleswoman who had met him years earlier. Melinda quickly became the rock in his life. She helped him regain full legal and creative control. With her support, Brian slowly returned to music on his own terms. He began performing again, cautiously at first. Then, in the early 2000s, something remarkable happened. Brian completed and released the long-lost Smile album in 2004, nearly 40 years after abandoning it. This wasn't just a nostalgic move. Smile received global praise. It showed that Brian Wilson still had the magic, even after decades of silence. More recognition followed. He was awarded the Kennedy Center Honors and received multiple Grammy Awards. He was also inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as part of the Beach Boys, and later into the Songwriters Hall of Fame. From 1999 to 2019, Brian toured around the world. He played with orchestras, reunited with old bandmates, and shared his music with new generations. Behind the scenes, Brian's life was finally calm. He and Melinda settled into a quiet life in Beverly Hills, where they raised several adopted children together. Their home was comfortable, filled with family routines and musical moments, because Brian didn't chase the luxury lifestyle many rock stars do. He didn't collect Ferraris or throw huge parties. Instead, he enjoyed classic Cadillacs, quiet time at home, and spending time with his wife and kids. Then, in 2021, Brian made another major business move. He sold his solo music rights and future Beach Boys royalties to Universal Music Publishing Group. The deal was worth an estimated $50 million. It secured his legacy and ensuring his family would be financially stable long after he was gone. As Brian Wilson entered his 80s, the world around him began to slow, but his place in music history only grew stronger. But behind the scenes, his health was beginning to decline. Suddenly, in early 2024, everything changed. Melinda Wilson passed away, leaving Brian without his lifelong protector and partner. After her death, concerns about Brian's memory, decision-making, and overall well-being grew more serious. Doctors diagnosed cognitive decline, and his loved ones decided it was time to step in. That same year, Brian was placed under a conservatorship to help manage his care. But this time, unlike in the dark days of Dr. Landy, the people in charge were those he trusted. His longtime manager and publicist, who had worked with him for decades, were given legal responsibility over his health decisions, daily needs, and finances, with the goal of honoring his wishes and keeping his legacy safe. In his final year, Brian lived a very private life in assisted care, supported by trained aides and medical staff. His home remained his base, but all daily matters were carefully managed by his conservators. There were no more tours, no more recording sessions, just peace, music, and care. Then, on June 20th, 2025, on his 83rd birthday, Brian Wilson passed away. The world mourned the loss of one of music's most important voices. At the time of his death, Brian's estate was valued at around $100 million. That included royalty streams from decades of Beach Boys classics and his solo career, along with the $50 million Universal deal he signed in 2021, which covered both future and past rights. His real estate holdings were also part of the total, including his longtime Beverly Hills home. Most importantly, a family trust had been carefully set up to ensure his adopted children would inherit and manage his legacy with care. But numbers were just part of the picture. Brian's legacy stretched far beyond money. He was remembered as the man who transformed pop music into something more emotional and sophisticated. Artists from Paul McCartney to Billie Eilish have cited him as an influence. Documentaries, tribute albums, and reissues of his work continue to introduce him to new generations. In his final years, he became a living legend who had survived the chaos of fame and still found peace on the other side. His music shaped generations, but his real story runs even deeper. It's about the cost of genius, the value of care, and the quiet resilience of a man who refused to give up on life, no matter how hard it got. What part of Brian Wilson's journey moved you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're feeling inspired, stick around for the next legend story coming your way.